This is all of China's dynasties in one video. Chinese History 101 by Learn Chinese Now 2 years ago. I said it before, but 3 years ago, I was listening to a podcast about the history of China. I can't remember the name of it. It might have just been the history of China. And there was like 300 to 400 episodes or something. And I did listen to good 200 of them until I got a bit bored, because the podcast was really interesting early on when it detailed like the creation myths of China, the early, the early rulers, the early history of it. But then at some point, it became just endless repetition, because in that weird light, in that podcast, it was mostly like going over the broad stroke of what happened from every ruler and all that. And so it tended to be like always the same. Either the guy is good and he has a good reign and there's not much to say, or it's like the guy is terrible, he does a bunch of fucked up stuff, and then China is in chaos again, or someone kills him. And, through like the many episodes I listened to, it was a lot of repetition. I don't think I even got close to the Three Kingdom era, so that's how far I listened to. But even now, it's been like 2-3 years and I don't remember that much. So I've always been super interested in like a super in-depth history of China. And this podcast were a little bit of that, but it was still like not that in-depth, because again, it was really touching on like the broad stroke of it. And so it felt like, again, like there wasn't enough individual story to keep me hooked. I think that's what it was. But I understand that, then the podcast would be like 10,000 episodes. But maybe someone will do that one day, Yeah. Anyway, let's see.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Learn Chinese Now. China has a 5,000-year history, and today we are going to look at China's most important dynasties and historical periods in order. Early Chinese history starts with legend. China has a story about a great flood in a similar way that Western civilization does. And after that, a man named Yu was assigned by the last of the legendary sage emperors, Shun, to tame the waters. Yu dug channels to allow the water to flow out to the sea and founded the Xia dynasty, Xia Chao, in approximately 2070 BC. Many historians view the Xia as a legendary dynasty, since no archaeological sites in China believed to be Xia have yielded written records to confirm that they belong to the Xia dynasty. China's next dynasty is the Shang Chao. The Shang are believed to have ruled from about 1600 to 1050 BC.
It's a good run.
A feature of the Shang is the bronze artifacts that have been discovered. From cups to steamers to cauldrons, the bronzes were believed to have been used in sacrificial rituals. These bronze artifacts got progressively bigger throughout the dynasty as technology improved. By the end of the dynasty, they were making bronzes weighing up to 200 pounds. It is during the Shang that we see the earliest style of Chinese writing, the oracle bone inscriptions, Jiaguwen. These are pictographs written on turtle shells that Shang kings used for divination. After the Shang degenerated into what is regarded as a period of decadence and low morality, a frontier state called Zhou rose up and conquered the Shang, starting the Zhou dynasty, Zhou Chao. It was during the Zhou that the idea of the mandate of heaven, Ming, came into being. A king or dynasty could only rule if they maintained heaven's favor. If a king acted tyrannically, heaven would give warnings in the form of natural disasters. If the king failed to heed these warnings, the dynasty would descend into chaos. For the first half of the Zhou dynasty, heaven seemed to be on the Zhou king's side. But the dynasty did eventually descend into chaos, beginning with the spring and autumn and warring states periods, 春秋战国. Although it was chaotic, it was during this period that a series of philosophers emerged, the most famous of which was Confucius and his teachings of filial piety and the 5 Confucian virtues of Ren, benevolence.
We've been reacting to the Epic History series about like the rise of China, because I guess at this point we call it China, but it's not quite China. I think for like most of the history up to this point, it was just called the Middle Kingdom, right? And the name China, if I'm not wrong, became a thing in like, the 20th century, right? And yeah, those Epic History videos are mostly on the 20th century and the end and the fall of the Qing dynasty, which in that dynasty, up to again, like 19 something, they were still like following the Confucius teaching, which is from that long ago, which is kind of insane how long that lasted. I mean, he had some good thing to say, I guess, but it's still insane that it lasted so long,
Yi, justice, Li, rituals, Zhi, wisdom, and Xin, faith, would dominate the next 2,000 years of Chinese culture. During the spring and autumn period, 722 to 481 BC, the Zhou king's power waned, and feudal lords started making and breaking contracts, taking hostages, and taking up arms. By the second half of this period, the Warring States period, 403 to 221 BC, the Zhou king's power was reduced to close to zero, and states started conquering each other one by one until just 7 states were left. It was then that the Qin state in the west saw an opportunity and rose up to conquer all other 6, unifying China once again under the Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BC. The rulers of the Zhou dynasty had been called kings, Wang in Chinese, but the Qin's ruler invented a new term, Huangdi, or emperor, a title which all subsequent dynastic rulers would use. This first emperor of the Qin, Qin Shi Huang, was a brutal ruler. He solidified his unification through a unification of culture, unifying weights and measures, written language, currency, and even the width of roads throughout the empire. Maintaining local currency or weights and measures was an act of treason. The Qin emperor is thought to have buried 460 scholars alive in a mass grave as a warning against defiance. After the Qin emperor died,
it really beat the story of like some of those rulers, right? I mean, it's like that in many countries. Like you'll have one that's kind of nice, he might not do a lot or progress the country a lot, but you know, at least it doesn't do anything to mess up. And then you'll have one that's absolutely insane. I can't remember which one, but like in that podcast I was talking about, there was one of the early Chinese emperor or something that was insanely decadent, and I think there was a story of him having like this little island in the middle of a lake or something, where he had like, I think, impaled woman or something, and he was doing some kind of blood orgy in the middle of it, some kind of story like that. Now obviously, you know, this kind of thing can often be exaggerated in history, because often the history of it is written by someone from like an opposing later dynasty or something, so they often purposefully make another one look bad in the history or something to make theirs look better or something. So you always have to take it with a grain of salt. But, you know, again, from what I remember that podcast, it was really like, one is good, then next emperor is insane, next one is kind of fine, next one is insane. It seemed to be just on and off, you know. And I guess that's what happened when, you know, the emperor tend to rule from like blood descent or something. It's not really like chosen someone who seemed like they would be good for the job. It's just like, you're the heir or something, so you take it. You're insane, well, whatever, you take it anyway. It's your job now.
Had over 7,000 terracotta warriors buried with him to protect him in the afterlife. This became one of the most famous relics from the Qin dynasty.
Yeah.
But the harsh reign of the Qin didn't last long. After the first emperor died in 210 BC, the empire destabilized. 202 BC, the Qin dynasty was defeated by Liu Bang, who founded the Han dynasty, Han Chao, sometimes referred to as China's first golden age. The Han dynasty adopted Confucianism as the state philosophy, almost doubled its territory, and developed trade with Central Asia and the Roman Empire along the Silk Road. It was a 400-year period of prosperity. After the fall of the Han dynasty in 220 AD, China would remain divided for several centuries. Immediately after the Han fell, China entered the Three Kingdoms period.
Oh. Wait. So I guess I was wrong. I thought the Three Kingdoms was earlier. Well, as always, I don't have the best knowledge. My knowledge of the Three Kingdoms is the Dynasty Warriors game, the Kingdom manga, and that's about it. Probably not the most accurate stuff.
220 to 265 AD. This was a period of battles between 3 contending powers. It is the subject of the classic Chinese book Romance of the Three Kingdoms, 三国演义. Eventually, the Wei state, with twice the population of the other 2, prevailed and unified China, starting the short-lived Jin dynasty, Jin Chao. However, the Jin dynasty was far from a period of stability. Palace intrigue led to a civil war between 291 and 306. The end of the Jin dynasty's control over all of China came when Xiongnu tribesmen had settled in northern China and proved hard to govern. They decided to attack the capital Luoyang in 311 AD, and they attacked Chang'an in 316 AD. For the next 100 years, North China became a battleground, and many citizens fled southwards to Nanjing, where the Jin had set up a government in exile. 420 to 589 AD is known as the Northern and Southern Dynasties period, Nanbei Chao. China was divided between North and South. Throughout this whole period of division, Buddhism, which had originally been introduced to China during the Han Dynasty, increased in popularity. By the year 477, North China had over 6,000 Buddhist temples and South China had close to 3,000. Some Confucianists criticized Buddhist monks for not providing heirs to their family. However, Buddhists argued that having a member of the family walk the path to enlightenment brought blessings to all their relatives. Many rulers during this time actively supported and raised money for the building of Buddhist temples, such as Wu Di of Liang, who once had himself held hostage until his court raised a huge sum of money to have him released. This money was then used to support Buddhist establishments.
That's
Finally,
crazy.
in 581 AD, China was again unified by the Sui dynasty, Sui Chao. The Sui Emperor Wen Di viewed himself as a Buddhist ruler and used military force to defend the Buddhist faith. Him and his successor had ambitious plans to rebuild China, but this took its toll on the populace. Over 1 million men were called up for military service in a campaign against Korea, for example. It was only 4 decades until the Sui dynasty.
Not to be that guy, but I understand like Buddhism is mostly a religion of peace, right? Like that's most of the teaching, absolute peace, and like isn't it a religion where like you have this thing about like if someone slaps your cheek, just give them your other cheek or something? So what I can understand that one of the emperor would be like we still need military to defend the country. Going straight up on a war of conquest is kind of insane when you claim to be a Buddhist ruler. It's so opposite to Buddhist teaching, no?
Was overthrown. The victor of this rebellion was a man named Li Yuan, a cousin of the second Sui emperor, who founded the Tang dynasty, Tang Chao, in 618 AD, and would rule as Emperor Gaozu before abdicating to his son, who ruled as Emperor Tang Taizong, and so started China's golden age. The Sui dynasty had started the civil service examination system based on the Confucian classics. The Tang expanded on this, setting up schools, issuing state versions of the Confucian classics, complete with commentaries. China now had a political system based more on merit rather than hereditary privilege, apart from the position of emperor. The Tang capital at Chang'an was very cosmopolitan. The city and its suburbs had around 2 million inhabitants, the biggest city in the world at the time. China's 3 religions of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism thrived in Tang times. Chang'an had hundreds of monasteries, temples, and some foreign churches. One of the most famous art forms to come out of Tang times was poetry. 2 of the most famous Chinese poets, Li Bai and Du Fu, lived during Tang times. Li Bai is known for his romanticism and drunken descriptions of the moon, while Du Fu was a realist poet who described the realities of the time. During Tang times, tea also went from being a medicinal tonic to the single most popular drink in China. This popularization was facilitated by Lu Yu, who wrote the Cha Jing, or Classic of Tea. He would later be known as Cha Sheng,
Sage of Tea.
Sage of Tea. But nothing lasts forever. Eventually, the Tang dynasty degenerated into local warlords battling for power, and in 960 AD was replaced by the Song dynasty, Song Chao. Although the Song dynasty started off strong with rapid economic development, it was militarily weak and could not exert the same dominance in Asia as the Han and Tang dynasties did. In the year 1126, the Song capital Kaifeng was attacked by Jurchens from the north. The emperor and 3,000 members of the imperial family were captured and taken north. After Chinese forces regrouped further south, the emperor's youngest son was proclaimed the new emperor in Hangzhou. After losing the north, the dynasty lasted a further century and a half. Yet on a cultural level, the Song dynasty still flourished. Policies were less restrictive, markets in cities could open at night, tea houses sprung up, and there were storytellers, puppet shows, and poets writing in the new Song dynasty style, Songci. The Song dynasty is known for its landscape paintings, or Shanshui Hua.
Beautiful.
Northern Song works often were huge, grand scenes. After the loss of the north, paintings were smaller, leaving large expanses of canvas empty, which scholars generally believe to represent the loss of the Chinese heartland and the feeling of emptiness that abounded after the Northern Song's defeat. The Southern Song scholars viewed protecting Confucian values as protecting the essence of Chinese culture. In Song times, one of the most important commentaries on the Confucian classics was published by the scholar Zhu Xi. This would later become the commentary on which all subsequent civil service examinations were based, up until the end of the civil service examination system in 1905. Even at the beginning of the Song dynasty, there was already a foreign state existing on territory to the north which had once been part of China. This was the
Mongol
Liao
Empire.
dynasty, Liao Chao, formed by the Khitan people around the fall of the Tang dynasty. It lasted from 907 to 1125 AD. Not only did the Liao dynasty have a Chinese name, but also took on the Chinese imperial hereditary system, in contrast to the Khitan way of electing the chief of the clan. This dynasty started a trend of foreign rule that would eventually unite the whole of China under the Mongols.
Here we go.
After the Liao was the Jin dynasty, Jin Chao, also called Da Jin or Great Jin. This was the dynasty which defeated the northern Song and pushed the Song imperial court south. It was founded by the Jurchen people whose descendants were the Manchus that later founded the Qing dynasty. The Jurchens first defeated the Liao and then turned on the Song. Having incorporated Chinese military experts into their army from defeated Chinese cities, they laid siege to Kaifeng, the Song capital. The city was defended by 48,000 troops with crossbows and flamethrowers. Yes, the Chinese had figured out gunpowder by this time, and although they didn't use it to make guns like in the West, there were a wide variety of Chinese weapons that used fire. The Jurchens brought 30 catapults to launch huge stones towards the city, iron sheeting to bridge the moat, and siege towers higher than the city walls, from which they threw.
Watching a video about China, the history of China's dynasties, very interesting.
Bombs down into the city, and so the Song capital fell. The Jin dynasty ruled over around 40 million people in North China and adopted many of the institutions of Chinese government. As the dynasty went on, the Jurchens started adopting more and more Chinese customs, such as language, dress, and rituals. Although this was disrupted after an assassination of the emperor by Jurchen officials protesting the assimilation to Chinese culture, by the end of the dynasty, most Jurchens did indeed speak Chinese, wear Chinese clothes, adopt Chinese names,
really
many even married the
yeah.
local population.
I see.
In the late 12th century, there arose another contender for the rule of all China, the Mongolian ruler Genghis Khan. Although the Mongol conquest of...
Which, not to be that guy, but I feel like I've been seeing it so much recently that people are trying to correct the Western way of pronouncing it. It's not Genghis Khan, it's, I think, Chinggis Khan, I believe, is what... Chinggis Khan is what you pronounce it as. But for some reason, it turned to Genghis Khan in the West, I think. History, I mean, I like history. History, totemo omoshiroi, very interesting. I like history a lot. Not really for studying, just history suki.
The Song started after Genghis Khan's death. Genghis Khan started what would become the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching all the way from Korea to Eastern Europe. It was Genghis's grandson, Kublai, who led the conquest of the Song. The Jin dynasty had already been defeated, and in the year 1271, Kublai moved his capital from Mongolia to Beijing, which at that time was called Dadu. This year marks the start of the Yuan dynasty, Yuan Chao. Like the Liao and the Jin, the foreign invaders adopted a Chinese name for their empire. The conquest of the south took some time, however. The Mongols had to build a fleet of boats, engaged in a 5-year siege of the city of Xiangyang in the Yangtze Valley, and after crossing the Yangtze in 1275, the Song Empress Dowager managed to summon a force of 200,000 to fight the Mongols. But the Mongols were a fearsome enemy, and after slaughtering the entire population of the city of Changzhou, the Song Empress surrendered. The Mongols finally defeated the last Song loyalists in a naval battle in the year 1279. Under Yuan rule, Chinese were allowed to maintain most of their customs and religious practices, although the Italian explorer Marco Polo noted that there was a lot of ethnic tension in China at the time.
I mean, I think it was the same in the West, right? Like, I think it was Batu Khan that conquered most of Russia and some of Eastern Europe. And, you know, they were basically like ruling over the people, but I don't think they were like assimilating them or anything, you know? It was really like, just do your thing, but pay us and, you know, listen to us, basically, I think.
Different races were subject to different taxation laws and were placed in a hierarchy. For example, a Chinese would be subject to severe penalties for fighting against Mongols, but a Mongol could get off with a mere fine if he killed a Chinese. Chinese were also forbidden from owning weapons. But at this time, China was considered the center of the world. Chinese culture was superior, and the emperor the son of heaven. The Yuan emperors kept Chinese advisors and reinstated the imperial examination system in 1315.
And it's back
Although they
again,
did have
yeah.
quotas
Okay.
to make sure ethnic Chinese, especially citizens of the former Song, were outnumbered by Mongols and other races in the government. Since China was now tied to a Eurasian empire, more Europeans than ever before visited China, and Chinese culture and inventions such as printing and gunpowder spread west. Before long, Europeans with some knowledge of the exotic lands and cultures of the East would start their own age of exploration, something which ethnic Chinese at the time, and in the centuries to come, were not too pleased about. In 1368, China was finally under the rule of an ethnic Chinese ruler again, and the Ming dynasty, or
The Ming.
Ming, was founded.
Definitely
Emperor
of
Taizu
that
had
one.
started off as a commoner, living in poverty as a youth. His parents had died when he was 16. He spent time in a Buddhist temple before joining a rebel group he would later come to lead. He first took Nanjing and then
Quite a
took his
story.
army right to the Mongol capital at Beijing. The Mongol ruler fled and Taizu established his dynasty.
Well done.
Taizu proved to be a very harsh ruler, conducting several purges of the elite and literati. However, the imperial examination system continued.
I guess makes sense when you have such a rise to power, like coming from the absolute bottom. You know, you've probably learned the hard way that, you know, don't trust anyone, everybody around you might betray you or something. That makes sense, yeah.
Testing students' knowledge of the four books Confucius Analects, Mencius, the Doctrine of the Mean, and the Great Learning,
The Mean.
as interpreted in the commentary of the scholar Zhu Xi. The Ming dynasty saw an explosion in publishing and vernacular literature. Blue and white Ming porcelain became a hot commodity in Europe. In the religious sphere, out of China's three religions, early Ming emperors favored Taoism and Taizu outlawed Christianity.
I don't know
However,
much
later
about
on,
Taoism.
a wave of Jesuit missionaries brought knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and geography to China, the most famous of which was Matteo Ricci, who lived in Beijing from 1601 to 1610. Control of China's borders proved troublesome for the Ming emperors. The Great Wall you see today was built in Ming times to keep the Mongols out.
Oh,
China's
yeah.
coasts faced threats from smugglers and pirates. China's naval power increased substantially during the Ming. The explorer Zheng He was dispatched by the emperor to go on several voyages looking for tribute states for the Ming Empire. Zheng He got as far as the coast of East Africa.
Let's get a jealous.
Despite the Chinese distrust of foreigners, many Western powers had become major maritime forces in Asia, and international trade with these foreign powers flourished, although
Yeah.
the Ming always regarded the foreign powers as mere tribute states and limited them to trading posts without access to the Chinese interior. But by the 1600s,
Not the worst
despite
idea, obviously.
positive economic growth, the Ming government had grown too large and expensive. A drop in temperatures during this time led to a shorter growing season and a famine between the years of 1627 and 28. Gangs started ravaging the countryside, and the state didn't have the financial resources to react. The Ming started having trade problems with the Japanese and the Spanish, which shut down major flows of silver into China, leading to further fiscal problems. As Ming society started to
Think, isn't this around? Yeah, this is basically like the time, well, just after the Imjin War, I think. Japan trying to conquer Korea. Then I think some of Manchuria, I believe, which failed. And also the time like the Spanish, the Dutch, and the British and other like European power are trying to, you know, get like to be the only one trading with like some of those Asian country, like Japan and China. I think this is around the time, like around the time that the TV show Shogun takes place in, I think. Well, just after, I think.
break down, different factions fought for power. The Ming's mandate of heaven had expired. In 1644, the warlord Li Zicheng marched on Beijing, and the Ming emperor committed suicide.
Everybody marched on
But
Beijing.
Li's rule of China hardly lasted. The Manchus, who had been building up their state and armies outside the Great Wall,
Here they come.
marched on China. A Ming general named Wu Sangui, who was tasked with guarding a Great Wall outpost, sided with the Manchus against Li and his rebels.
Wow,
So
look at that.
started the Qing dynasty, Qing Chao, also called Da Qing, another period of alien rule for China, but
The only dynasty I really know from recent video we reacted to, but we know the end of it, right? From the epic history video, like the fall of it, basically. Yeah, so a little bit.
period that brought wealth, stability, and territorial expansion, at least until China was weakened by foreign powers in the 1800s. In 1645, the Qing rulers ordered all men in the empire to adopt the Manchu hairstyle. they had to get a haircut and start growing what was called a queue within 10 days or face death. This was to show their loyalty to the new dynasty. Most Chinese saw no option but to obey.
I wonder the logic of it. I mean, obviously, you know, from my Westerner sensibility of hairstyle, I don't think it looks good. So again, was it like literally the point? Like it's some kind of humiliation ritual to show your devotion? Or was there more to it?
It took several decades for the Qing to track down and crush the last Ming loyalists. Once Emperor Kangxi took power in 1669, China entered a period of stability that lasted 130 years and saw only 3 emperors on the throne.
That's really good.
Kangxi and his grandson Qianlong each ruled for over 60 years. Kangxi embraced Chinese culture, continuing the imperial examination system, allowing ethnic Chinese to have a place in the government, and ordering the completion of the Kangxi Dictionary of Chinese Characters. Kangxi also welcomed Jesuit missionaries to the court, appointing them to the Imperial Board of Astronomy. After the short reign of Kangxi's son Yongzheng, the Emperor Qianlong took over, starting another 60-year reign. Qianlong was a patron of the arts. In addition to studying and painting himself, he also amassed a huge collection of Chinese artwork at the palace. He added his own poems and calligraphy to many paintings. During this time, China's territory expanded to include the whole of Tibet, Xinjiang in the west, Mongolia, and the island of Taiwan, previously a Dutch colonial outpost. In the Qing period, Confucianism became more strict. Scholar officials feared a similar unraveling of society that happened in the late Ming. But threats to Chinese society came from the outside as well as from within. The Chinese had previously limited Western trade only to certain ports and limited Westerners' access to the interior of the country, regarding the Western powers as mere tribute states. In 1793, the British sent Lord Macartney to meet with the Emperor Qianlong.
We're definitely getting to the Opium Wars.
Came with gifts of scientific instruments, carpets, knives, glass objects, all meant to arouse Chinese interest in British manufactured goods. But Qianlong showed no interest, proclaiming in a letter to the King of England, "We possess all things. I have no use for your country's manufactures." By the year 1800, the British were purchasing about 1/7 of the tea produced in China and paying for their tea using silver. This contributed about 1/10 of state revenue through the tax they paid on tea. However, since China refused to buy British goods, this led to a massive trade imbalance. British silver flowed into China and never came back. The British needed a product to balance out the relationship. This product came in the form of opium. The British East India Company transported opium.
I see that I guess the British really don't have the best history with tea, even though you often associate, you know, the British with tea. I mean, you know, tea caused major problem with the US and seems like to an extent also with China, leading to all this. Yeah, interesting. Tea is surprisingly something in history that has caused a lot of this, it seems like.
From India to China, then brought tea from China back to Britain. The Qing court understood the perils of opium addiction and sought to outlaw the substance. But this led to further confrontation with the British, who possessed superior naval forces. And thus the so-called Opium Wars led to several unfair treaties between the Qing dynasty and the British. The Qing were forced to open up more ports to British trade. They ceded the island of Hong Kong for the British to use as a colony, and the opium trade went on unaffected. Other European powers, such as the French and the Germans, as well as the Russians and Japanese, all succeeded in occupying parts of Chinese territory and forcing the Chinese to open up more ports for trade. The 1800s also saw several rebellions internally, the largest of which was the Taiping Rebellion. Faced with intrusion by Western powers and
which I still haven't seen any video on the details of it, but it was like one of the like biggest amount of deaths or something in history in one event. And someone told me like it seemed like a meme summary of it, but it's because one guy called himself Jesus or something, and it led to all this. Again, I haven't actually seen yet any in-depth video about the Taiping Rebellion, though I'm interested. It's on the endless list in my head of stuff that has been mentioned in some videos, and I think I need to watch video about it, but I haven't gotten around to it yet.
Rebellions from within, the Qing decided to try to use some aspects of Western learning to strengthen the dynasty. The self-strengthening movement, or 自强运动, was started. China started to industrialize, build Western weapons and warships, railroads, factories, and promote study of Western science and mathematics. Yet this movement was ultimately unsuccessful.
late.
During a battle with the French in Vietnam in the 1880s, it took the French only an hour to destroy an entire fleet of new Chinese ships. By the end of the 1800s, Qing China had been utterly humiliated. Losing a war with Japan over Korea, they were forced to hand over Taiwan and Liaodong to the Japanese. This started a frenzy of other countries seizing territory for themselves in China. It was almost looking like China was going to be carved up by Western powers the same way Africa was. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion prompted a force of 20,000 Allied soldiers from the Western powers to march from Tianjin to Beijing and put down the rebellion and then loot the city. The Qing were ordered to pay twice the government's annual revenue as repatriation.
I think this what is more or less called the century of humiliation, right? So again, from this point on, you know, if you want me to react to what happens from here on, check out my epic history reaction to the so far 3-part series they've done, which covers like, you know, the fall of the Qing and then, you know, the stuff happening from like 1905 to, I think the last one went up to just before the Korean War, so 49, I think.
To the Western powers. Amazingly, the Qing managed to hold on to power into the beginning of the 20th century. But change was inevitable. In 1905, the centuries-old system of imperial service examinations was abolished, and a modern Western-style school system was set up. In 1912, the last Qing emperor abdicated. China entered the modern era,
it was like
an era that, despite a hopeful start, would lead to the worst destruction of traditional Chinese culture and the largest loss of Chinese life in history. Scholars today look back on the imperial examination system based on Confucian values as one of the most advanced political systems in history. Some even feel bringing back aspects of Confucian learning would be essential to reinvigorating Chinese culture and reversing negative trends in modern Chinese society.
It's one of those things where, like, again, this is one video and we've watched a bunch more videos about China, but I'm still like more than aware at this point that I still know so little about how things worked out. And from what we know, again, from the, you know, the epic history videos, from what happens in the next 50 years, it's one of those things where, like, you could almost argue if that, you know, like at this point, the Confucius stuff and like the long history of China, you know, I don't think they had to fully break away with it like they did, especially the Communist Party, right, eventually, the People's Republic of China. I don't think they had to fully break away with it. But it's also understandable that, you know, things were so not working out for a while that they really thought that they had to break away from everything and get a bunch of new ideas to actually survive as a country against everything else. Now I know there's a lot more to it than that, but I feel like that's some aspect of it, I assume. I don't actually know how things are in China these days in terms of like acknowledging their own history. Obviously, like they showed stuff like Tiananmen Square, which we know is very buried, right? But I'm talking like some of the older history. Like, do they actually teach any of it, or is it literally like fully something that they're just like no one cares? They only teach the history of like the, you know, like the last 70, 80 years or something. I don't actually know how it is. Yeah. Interesting. Again, like it's a subject that I don't have enough context, but pretty interesting. Okay, well, great video. I very much enjoyed it. It was a good recap. Yeah. And again, it's like such a small portion too, right? Because every part of like every dynasty could be probably hours long with all the history that every dynasty might have, you know? Yeah. Sometimes I think like, you know, as I was talking about earlier with the podcast I was talking about, like, you know, what I like is like some insanely long series of video going into every dynasty and not just like the big event, but like talking more about like the smaller thing in the culture, the smaller stories, you know. I think that's what I often likes in this kind of videos for me, is having some like more personal stories to relate to and make me actually care about the period itself, maybe. Does that make sense? But yeah, great video.